Psalm 67 is at the same time familiar and yet a little bit challenging if you pause to reflect on the message, because there are some details there that, although it's familiar, seem to be somewhat tweaked. And then you could read through it and you could kind of become a little blasé and say, oh, another give thanks to God psalm. So this psalm is an attempt to recenter the context and the perspective of the worshiper's life. Not just to be thankful, because an attitude of gratitude is a good way to get through life, but to refocus that this is the God who cares for us. So this, again, like all the Psalms, ultimately is a psalm about God and about the nature of what it means to worship this God because of his engagement with his creation. So a major theme in Psalm 67 is the idea of blessing, but what does that mean and how is it expressed? So the concept of blessing, as is presented here in Psalm 67, is embracing all of life as an act of worship. That worship isn't that thing we do, and you're probably going to get tired over the years of hearing me say this. It's not just this hour that we're together. It's a life. Worship is life being expressed to God, and it encompasses all 168 hours. So a blessing then, in the context of Psalm 67, in the context of this covenant that God had established with Israel, was that he would be their provider. They would learn dependence upon him, and through that dependence would understand that there's a purpose for their existence. And one of their purposes for their existence, like it is ours, being God's image bearers, and Israel collectively was God's image bearer as well, is that we can demonstrate the goodness of God, the faithfulness of God, especially in times of adversity. So in Psalm 67, there's an underlying assumption of the sovereignty and authority of God, not just to the political realities of life and the day-to-day struggles of life, but that all of creation is subject to his authority and is ultimately accomplishing his purposes. The very first part, verses 1 and 2 of Psalm 67, echo of Aaron's blessing that we find in Numbers chapter 6. Except it has been changed, because in Aaron's blessing, it was, may the Lord bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you. But notice here it says, may the Lord be gracious to us and bless us and make his face shine upon us. Why? Not for our comfort, but that your ways may be known on the earth. It's not just so that we engage and become bigger and better, but so other people can be exposed to the majesty of our God and your salvation among all nations. And then at the very end, in verses 6 and 7, so verses 1 and 2 are at the beginning. Now verses 6 and 7 mirror that, and this is the Abrahamic blessing. So we start with Aaron's blessing, and now we come to the Abrahamic blessing. Verse 6 says, then the land will yield its harvest, and our God will bless us. God will bless us, and all the ends of the earth will fear him. And although this isn't word for word the same, it's the language taken from Genesis chapter 12, where God established his blessing to Abraham, his promise to Abraham, that through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And then in verse 3, we see a phrase that's repeated twice. Verse 3 says, may the peoples praise you, O God. May all the peoples praise you. And then notice verse 5. May the peoples praise you, O God. May all the peoples praise you. The psalmist did not have a bad memory and accidentally write it down twice. He's building this structure that there's the Aaron blessing, the Aaronic blessing, the Abrahamic blessing, both of which are intended not just to bring comfort to God's people, but that through the blessing of Abraham, through the blessing of Aaron and Israel, the nations would be blessed, that God would be known, that God would be revealed. So may all the people praise you. And this is a great clue for us that this psalm is written in a chiastic format. And then we come to the core of Psalm 67. May the nations be glad and sing for joy, for you rule the peoples justly and guide the nations of the earth. And that's what the heart of this psalm is all about. And this is essentially what it means to be blessed. And you could look at that superficially and you could say, well, that's not happening. And we could start listing all the world events that would suggest that God is not ruling the nations with justice. Well, there are two responses to that. First, in this original context of Psalm 67, probably written during the era of David, the purpose of Israel was to represent Christ on earth. And if they had fulfilled their purposes, the king, who was the anointed one, a forerunner of Messiah, would have had influence. So the nations would have been ruled with justice. It didn't happen because Israel constantly went into idolatry and abandoned their faith relationship with God. But this was the ideal, and this was the hope, and this was the intention of the promise to Abraham and to Moses and to David, that through this line of people, a blessing would come that would impact the entire world. Now, 2,000 years later, or thousands of years later, we know that this ultimately is accomplished through Christ. And we still look forward to that return of Messiah when his kingdom will be literally established on earth. But it doesn't deny the reality that God is reigning. And this is a psalm that connects the sovereignty and authority of God with the idea of blessing. Sovereignty says that before the creation of the world, God established the plan, the one plan that was going to exalt him and bring glory to him and demonstrate his goodness to all that he has created. That included men and women falling into sin. But his authority, it's not about control, it's about his authority permeates this, and he is working all things to the counsel of his will, Paul says in Ephesians, and he is accomplishing this eternal plan that's never been at risk. Satan has never owned part of it. God is not reacting to him. It has been established from before the creation of the world. And that gives us confidence because every detail of our life is with purpose according to God's sovereign plan. And he has authority over it, not just control, but authority. So the psalmist, in a very different context, understands this and expresses it. May the nations be glad and sing for joy. Why? Because despite the chaos happening in their lands, God still has sovereignty. Whether their king is Nebuchadnezzar or some other crazy fool, it doesn't matter. God still has authority over their lands. So the peoples should praise you, God, because you have authority and sovereignty over all things. You rule the peoples justly. This is why we live by faith. We're not about pursuing a religion or a spirituality. We're about pursuing a relationship with the Creator God. And faith has to be about relationship. And the object of our faith is the living God who, although unseen, has revealed himself through Scripture and through Jesus Christ. And although it doesn't make sense and we're confused, and we have lots of examples like that. For example, Job. We embrace this life of faith because we know the essence and nature and character of the God who created all of it. Our faith, Christianity, is not just a system of dogma and rituals that we perform in ceremony. It is a relationship, a reconciled relationship with the Creator God, who we cannot see, but we know through Jesus Christ and through His Word. And so we embrace life as an act of worship in its totality, because even though it doesn't make sense, even though our faith may cause us loss and suffering, we have thanksgiving, not because it's a great attitude of gratitude, but because we know that God is ruling with justice. And that's the heart of Psalm 67. It's not thanksgiving because everything's going great and we had a wonderful harvest, but as Habakkuk said, even if the fig tree doesn't grow and the cattle stall is empty, I will give thanks to God because He is my defender and my strength. And that's what the psalmist is saying in Psalm 67. We don't give thanks to God because life is great and we've got everything we want. That's wonderful, and we should be thankful for that. We give thanks to God because He is ruling with justice, although we don't see it. And often, and millions of believers around the world are not experiencing it as they suffer in jails and other types of persecution. So we come in safety and security on a Sunday morning and we gather for corporate worship. And I know we can't do everything. I am just dying and I'm putting my brain together. How can we get some music back into this and get back to doing what we were doing? How do we reach out to the families that were part of our community and have wandered because of COVID and love them and get them re-engaged with their faith? I have to believe that God is ruling all this with justice, and in His time and His way, those things will come together. So the message of Psalm 67 is the greatest blessing of all is God's providence and rulership over all He has created. And the microcosm of this reality is how we see God ruling and acting in the people of God. So Israel was a microcosm of God's goodness, and as they had good relationships with one another, and they didn't always, but should have, but their interactions with one another becomes a microcosm of what God is doing on the larger scale. And as people observed that interaction in that community of faith, it was a proclamation to the other nations of the goodness of this God, in contrast to the other belief systems that they held. And the same thing is true today. As we, as a community of faith, have healthy interactions and grow and are dependent on one another and serve one another and love one another and, yes, forgive one another, because sometimes we're idiots and we are offensive, but we also are forgiving of one another, then that becomes the testimony that people realize. And they may not say, oh, I want to be a part of that, but at least they acknowledge, and they may not express it well, but they begin to understand that this thing called God and this relationship with Him has transformed His people.